You did not have to do that. You knew you did not have to do that. How could you have done that? Can you live with yourself? What you've gone and done. Look what you've gone and done here. For God's sake, you're a bunch of fucking degenerates.
Here we are once again on the cutting room floor, forced to watch as a mega studio conglomerate mutilates yet another beloved franchise, all in the name of a quick buck. It's like clockwork. Any intellectual property that's developed a brand through its own artistic merit inevitably gets shackled to the growing cancer of live-action adaptations, only to have the keys to those projects be handed to a group of equally out-of-touch showrunners. And I say that because they're all really cavalier about how they know absolutely nothing about Halo for some reason.
We didn't look at the game, says Season 1 showrunner Stephen Kane. We didn't talk about the game, we talked about the characters and the world, so I never felt limited by it being a game. Then why even make a show based on a game?
Now that quote is pretty significant, not just because Stephen Kane is borderline impressively stupid, but it only further cements that the writers made concerted efforts to distance this show from the games as much as they possibly could. Now, I'm pretty lenient when it comes to creative leads foregoing certain elements with a piece of source material, especially if it's done for the sake of crafting the best possible story you can tell. After all, not everything from a comic book, or a game in this case, is always going to translate well into live action. But ignoring crucial source material altogether simply because you want to tell a wildly different story is another matter entirely. And unfortunately, the brain rot doesn't seem to just stop with the writing team.
You watch and you get kind of involved with what the story is, and you hate the bad guy because he murders people in an airport and stuff like that. And then all of a sudden it's time to take the controller, Spielberg said. And the second you get the controller, something just turns off in the heart, and it becomes a sport. You know, I kind of find this entire thing pretty hypocritical of Steven Spielberg, considering the fact that, you know, he totally didn't direct and write one of the most iconic video games of the early 2000s. What the fuck?
Ironic.
Frankly, I'm still all for Death of the Author, but the reason I'm showing all this is because it's quite clear why the showrunners can crank out 265 drafts of the show's script and still not even be bothered to look at any of the main Halo titles. None of them respect gaming as a medium, let alone the franchise they're attempting to adapt. Fans aren't expecting everything to be one-to-one, but at the end of the day, this is still a Halo adaptation. If the studio and the creative leads don't want the show to be held and judged to the same standards as the games, then they should have created their own IP instead of abusing the name of Halo for a quick buck. Which, speaking of abuse, every single ounce of dialogue in this show is pure torture.
Spartans aren't human. They just keep on killing. So there's nothing left to kill.
Don't worry, that dogshit talking point is only going to get brought up repeatedly throughout the show. But the pressing issue here is that Spartans were never meant to be mindless murder machines.
Our primary objective was to get the station's relay back online.
Your primary objective, Commander, are you a puppet or a Spartan?
In fact, one of the main directives of the Spartan program was to stop insurrections, all while minimizing military casualties. The UNSC and ONI wanted the current colonies and settlements to work with them, whether to further interests of human expansion or for simple trade reasons. And enacting draconian measures when dealing with simple outbursts of civil unrest would kind of be the worst possible way to go about that. But of course, this is Diet Halo, and we can't actually use any of the source material to explain or rationalize anything that happens in this backwards-ass universe. Though, disbarring all of that, let's entertain the idea that turning Spartans into armored sci-fi Nazis isn't the most impractical decision that the UNSC or ONI could possibly make. Based on what the show vomits out to the audience within the first few minutes, everyone in this room should just be dead.
Thanks, Marine. One Spartan is worth 100 Marines.
If that's true, then a small squad of Spartans should be able to tear through this place with no issues at all. I mean, it's kind of a difficult sell that the UNSC would have never entertained sending Spartans to deal with the situation on Madrigal, since this random group of rebels somehow managed to secure their independence for a considerable amount of time, despite using nearly 600-year-old weapons. And God forbid if the Order was ever greenlit to send in tanks or a standard convoy of warthogs. This outpost and everyone in it would be screwed in a matter of sheer seconds. You can claim I'm nitpicking all you like, but nothing about what's shown on screen falls in line with the conflict that's supposed to be taking place in the story. These are very basic world-building concepts that the show is already drastically dropping the ball on. However, we then cut away to our lovable gang of horrendous haircut-sporting, magic space shroom enthusiasts.
Madrigal, the galaxy's highest concentration of heavy hydrogen. Power your ships and power your drugs.
What's that? You already find her to be insufferable? Well, don't worry, it's not like she's one of the most important characters in the show or something. More on that later. But just before Kwan is about to drift off into the 5th dimension, she notices something in the distance, and discovers that it's actually a Covenant Phantom. Now, there's already a number of issues here. For starters, how the hell did no one from the outpost spot this Phantom just chilling out here in the middle of the open? And we know they've certainly been here a while, since it's revealed later on they've managed to dig out this massive cave. Do the guards stationed on the walls just never, actually keep guard? Plus, I kind of can't get over how mind-numbingly stupid it is that this random gang of teenagers somehow managed to just stumble upon this detachment of elites, despite the fact that motion detection has only been a thing since the first Halo game, and all it would have taken for Kwan not to spot them is just to have the ship initiate active camo. Not that these elites trying to keep their presence a secret makes all that much sense, especially considering, as everyone's favorite child-murdering Jedi would say,
"This is where the fun begins."
Though while the Covenant are getting their genocide on, we learn a very bit of juicy information from Mr. Bagpipes here.
Holy mother of God, it's all true.
What? What's true?
I thought it was UNSC Propaganda!
Even though we learn shortly after this whole scene that the UNSC have apparently been fighting the Covenant for years.
We've been fighting these alien creatures for years and we still have no idea what they want.
I know I'm kind of jumping the gun a bit here, but having these rebels be completely oblivious to the Covenant's existence, despite years of humanity's ongoing conflict with them, just downright doesn't seem possible. There'd be recorded footage, testimony from other planets or colonies, and unprecedented UNSC casualties. Even if all these reports of Covenant invasion were bullshit, what would the UNSC stand to gain from any of it? Temporary compliance? However, Master Chief then suddenly arrives with his band of merry douchebags to take out the Covenant, but only after nearly everyone in the outpost has been completely eviscerated. And as if the writers pushing the modern-day trope of turning the UNSC into an evil warmongering faction wasn't bad enough already, their arrival this late into the battle can only mean one of two things. Either the UNSC originally sent a squad of Spartans to wipe out a majority, if not everyone in this outpost, only to end up running into Covenant forces, or they knew about the attack well in advance and just decided to let the elites slaughter off their political opposition, along with innocent civilians at that, before actually dealing with the Covenant. And I say that because both the general of this insurrectionist group and a random elite are marked for death on Chief's visor. Which again, I have to bring up that mankind at this point has been in an ongoing conflict with the Covenant for years. You'd think the UNSC and ONI's top priority would be saving the human race from total annihilation, not ordering hits on small insurrectionist groups. And there's not a whole lot of opportunity to really downplay how much of a threat the Covenant are at this point in the script, when they're practically tearing through this colony like paper. A colony that's somehow capable enough to maintain their independence from the UNSC. But that's not the only thing in the show that's completely smeared and shit. I'd consider it flat-out heresy to label anything that happens in this scene as combat.
See, now that's some bullshit.
I guess everything would have turned out much differently for the colonists if all of them were armed with steel fucking pipes. Because it's not like getting in close range with an energy sword-wielding elite would result in absolute certain death or anything. In fact, I have no idea how the hell damage works in this show exactly. From what I can tell, it seems like it's not necessarily the weapon itself that matters, but whoever the person it is that's holding it. If there's one thing this show is good at, it's being consistently inconsistent. It's abundantly clear that the creators have no clue how to properly depict a live-action clash with the Covenant. One moment you'll have whole magazines of ammunition get completely absorbed by an elite's shields, only to in turn have other elites getting taken out with 3 pistol shots. One second, elites are completely melting people with energy swords, and then the next, MC is taking on 3 of them at close range with ease. Certain visual bits may be spot on at times, but they're completely ignorant of how shields and weapons as a whole are mechanically supposed to function. Which is also why I think the show actively avoids incorporating/mixing the other Covenant species together during fight scenes. The writers have a purely aesthetic understanding of elites, and anything else thrown into the mix would be too heavy of a wrench for this show to carry. It's kind of depressing, actually. The enemy variety has always been a huge factor for what makes the combat in Halo titles so engaging. Grunts, while alone, aren't typically anything to be taken seriously, but when a group can be fairly threatening. Up close, jackals are pretty vulnerable, but from afar can be incredibly deadly. Especially Halo 2 legendary sniper jackals, but we don't need to get too into that. Elites and brutes are pretty imposing in confined spaces with their devastating melee attacks, though are pretty weak against long-range weapons. And hunters are arguably the most challenging threat of all, equipped with bulletproof armoring and mounted fuel rod cannons, making their attacks on higher difficulty levels a borderline one-hit kill if one does land on you. But the opening in their backplate leaves them vulnerable to damage. All of this is what makes the Covenant's presence in the Halo universe so significant. It's not just a standing army of one particular race, but a collective force of varying species with dedicated roles and specialties, united under one set belief, imposing their will upon all of humanity and anything else that stands in their path. The attempt this show makes towards any ounce of world building laughably pales in comparison, simply because the creative leads have no idea what world it is they're trying to build. They refuse to look at any of the main source material, but also want this series to somehow to appeal to dedicated fans. And as desperate as they are to have their cake and eat it, this absolute catastrophe appeals to neither normies or fans, and continuously fails to adapt anything from Halo in a meaningful way. Which, speaking of failures, after MC goes selectively deaf for about 30 seconds and allows General Rando here to die, he decides to round up Silver Team to go search for an enemy landing site, because apparently everyone in this show is blind as hell.
Chief? Covenant Phantom.
Well, no fucking shit!
Once inside the excavated cave, though, Chief starts doing some ASMR audio logs.
Zone Echo. Now investigating the interior of a nearby cave. Assessment report. Covenant excavation.
Despite Halsey having undisrupted footage of the mission log, but fuck it, whatever. So during their search, the two of them stumble upon an unknown alien artifact, and MC's initial reaction is to immediately walk over and touch it.
Retrieving now.
What the hell are you doing, you absolute meathead? There's no telling how insanely dangerous this artifact is, and instead of waiting for a team of scientists or experts to properly handle it, you decide on the spot to put your entire squad at risk.
Not a great plan.
But of course, we need to have John be a total turnip and manhandle the damn thing so we can show his buried childhood memories, and also get one of the big reveals for this episode. However, we'll unfortunately have to stick a pin in that topic for later. After John's freakout session, though, this random elite turns on his active camo and reminds us all that Kwan still exists in the plot. Granted, you really have to take your W's wherever you can get them, since she basically never shuts the fuck up for the rest of this show. I'm not being hyperbolic either. In what's supposed to be a live-action Halo adaptation, this random new side character who realistically has very little, if any, actual impact on the events of this series, has just as much, if not arguably more screen time than Master Chief. All because John is reminded that Kwan does in fact exist in the story and brings her on board his ship headed back to Reach. I have no idea what makes him decide to do any of this, and apparently neither does he.
Why would a Spartan do that?
I don't know. Don't know. Don't know.
I don't know.
I don't know.
Oh, trust me, that line gets used as a get-out-of-jail-free card for a lot of bullshit that happens in this script. However, Kwan then awakens to a hologram call from Miranda Keys, which you'd think she'd wait until after Kwan's gotten the chance to wipe her friend's blood off her face, but time is of the essence. Naturally, the UNSC want to alert the other colonies and settlements about the impending Covenant threat.
Yours isn't the first planet to face the Covenant, and unfortunately, it won't be the last. If you would upload a few words to the other colonies, just explaining what you saw.
But apparently, not even an existential threat like the Covenant can get rid of her UNSC hate boner.
What if I say the UNSC sent a bunch of Spartans to attack us? And then you kidnapped me to force me to say it was all the aliens.
Kwan, the entire encounter was recorded.
You people can make video look like anything. And when they hear my version, you can forget about Unity or whatever.
Do you have the memory of a goldfish? Did you not sit there and watch helplessly as elites slaughtered off your entire outpost? Had the Spartans not shown up at all, you'd be dead with them. It's not exactly propaganda if the threat of Covenant invasion is actually real. Wouldn't you want to spread awareness to prevent the same thing happening to other colonies or settlements anyways? What even is there to gain by lying about something like this? I'm so lost. Unfortunately, because the show insists that Kwan is somehow the correct one in this situation, Miranda ends up hearing out her demands.
What is it you want?
Independence for Madrigal.
I'm simply at a loss for words. I didn't think it was physically possible to create a character so self-absorbed and oblivious to reality that she can quite literally watch her friends and family die to mankind's biggest existential threat and still demand that the UNSC serve her political interests, as opposed to her helping them save the entire human race. But by God, they fucking did it. And maybe I would have been fine to let all this go if the writers didn't insist that Kwan is more important to the story than she actually is. However, we then cut away to a scene on Reach, where we have a painfully boring exchange between Halsey and Admiral Goski.
117's bringing her in.
One survivor's not going to make my job any easier. The security committee is looking for an excuse to cut your funding.
That's right. You see, the Spartans kind of dropped the ball with protecting this outpost from getting wiped out by the Covenant. Even though the UNSC wanted them dead anyways because they were all insurrectionists, and the show makes it quite clear that they're no strangers to wiping out their political opposition. Yeah, I have to admit, I'm having a hard time connecting the dots here myself. Nor should we gloss over the glaringly apparent reality that the Spartans are humanity's only viable weapon against the Covenant, and killing her funding at this stage in the war against them would be the worst decision that the UNSC could possibly make. If anything, this massacre should provide more incentive to not only continue to fund Halsey's research, but to increase funding. And while we're on the subject of the Covenant, we then cut away to a scene on the High Charity. Yes, you're saying that correctly. These fanatical Forerunner-worshipping zealots who believe that the Halo installations are actually gateways to higher planes of existence are kowtowing to a human. These prophets are supposed to be the gravest threat towards mankind, but yet they buckle and give in to every single order this complete rando human dishes out to them. Though, just when you think this storyline couldn't possibly get any more painstakingly awful, we then cut back to learn some new fun facts about Diet Chief.
You know, we've actually met before today.
When was this?
When you killed my mother, she was at a meeting. Before they got into all that, you and 3 other Spartans showed up, responding to an insurrectionist bomb threat.
Wonderful. The altruistic super soldier willing to sacrifice himself time and time again to save humanity has now been retconned and denigrated into a mindless murder machine that unquestionably executes political targets. Because it's not like the writers didn't spend the first few minutes beating the audience over the goddamn head with that talking point. We need to have this completely expendable side character explain to John that murder is bad. Lucky for her that MC managed to gain some free will from touching a magic alien rock a few seconds ago. Otherwise, something so profound would have gone right over his fucking empty head. However, the UNSC decide during their whole conversation to have Kwan pay her mom and dad a visit. Permanently. Which is a little strange considering Admiral Shit-for-Brain's whole spiel about optics. If nothing else, you'd think they'd at least wait to do a round of questioning on her before immediately resorting to the whole murder thing. But that would actually make some form of sense, and that's a luxury this show can't afford. Shortly after receiving the order, though, Master Chief's free will suddenly kicks into overdrive. He refuses to execute the hit on Kwan and decides to kill off all the cameras in the ship to avoid alerting his superiors. only to end up alerting his superiors. The Pelican's oxygen levels are then depleted, only for them to be immediately restored due to Chief just flipping over a switch.
If he's unconscious, how come he's opening panels in the ship?
What's in A16?
Atmosphere controls.
So level with me here, because this is going to sound like a pretty crazy question. But why in the absolute peanut butter fuck would the UNSC design their Pelicans with a lever inside the passenger bay that can shut off all of the oxygen to the ship? What practical purpose would that serve people who are flying out in the cold, dead vacuum of space? I'm no expert, but I kind of think that lever's there to solely prevent both MC's and Kwan's certain death. Not to mention it's also insanely counterintuitive to have a switch like this even installed in Pelicans, when their system on Reach is designed to kill any ship on a moment's notice. Though I suppose we also shouldn't gloss over that the decision to kill all of the oxygen to Chief's ship ultimately comes from Halsey's big reveal.
I think he's having memories.
What?
He's having memories? To what extent does that policy carry over? Are Spartans prohibited from relating and bonding with other Spartans through shared experiences? Or does it just strictly apply to childhood memories? And even then, what practical use would removing someone's childhood memories even serve? It seems like suppressing people's past against their knowledge isn't necessarily the best way to instill loyalty amongst your ranks. In fact, it's kind of the polar opposite. And the UNSC obviously have to be aware of that reality since they have whole divisions and departments of people who most certainly aren't brainwashed zombies. We then cut back to the Pelican, where Kwan in all of her infinite wisdom decides to point a gun twice her size at the guy who took down the detachment of aliens that wiped out her entire colony, and is currently coated in bulletproof Mjolnir armor.
This is Mark 6 Mjolnir armor. The outer layer is enhanced titanium, you won't even dent it.
And surprisingly, I can't even say that this is the most cringe-inducingly stupid thing about this whole scene. An unhinged, traumatized girl who happens to hold an outspoken disdain towards Spartans and the UNSC is currently pointing a gun at Chief, and his initial reaction to the entire situation is to remove the one thing that would prevent his otherwise certain death.
No! God, please, no! No! No!
You ever take that thing off?
Wherever have I seen this before? Now I think we can put all the bullshit aside and safely say that we've finally reached the crux issue with this episode. Because whether this series exists in a separate timeline from canon or not, the decision to show Master Chief's face is ultimately attached to the character himself. And I must admit it's certainly a ballsy one, especially to do so in the first episode. Now, aside from the meta conversation about how John's face is never completely shown in the games, and how a creative decision like this is arguably robbing lifelong fans of what would otherwise be an iconic moment in gaming history, there's still pressing issues within the episode as to why John removing his helmet in this specific scenario is a really fucking stupid idea. As I laid out earlier, Kwan is pretty out of her gourd. More so than usual. Her incredibly strong distrust and prejudice towards the UNSC is compounded on top of the fact that she's currently in a traumatized state and is holding a gun at the Spartan responsible for the death of her mother. Kwan's sudden shift in her perspective and decision to not kill Chief could work in an interaction like this, if there was any actual established history between the two of them. But this is a girl that John barely even knows, and the script has to actively restrain her from otherwise acting on clearly defined motivations. Because Kwan's presence in the story has to adhere to the stereotypical trope of the female side character helping the main protag regain his humanity, even though in all reality his free will is actually the product of contrived bullshit MacGuffin magic. Whether or not the creative lead should have shown John's face is something I'm still relatively iffy on, but if nothing else, I can certainly say that the reveal definitely didn't belong here. However, we're then presented with another scene on Reach where Silver Team is being briefed by Halsey.
When that ship lands, I want you to secure and protect Master Chief from anyone who actively threatens his life, whatever the circumstances.
So does the chain of command just not apply here? Halsey's a researcher, not a military officer. It seems far more likely, based on everything we know so far, that Spartans would have been specifically programmed to only carry out orders from military personnel. Not to mention that she's effectively ordering them to openly aid a fugitive from the UNSC, which is something you'd think Spartans shouldn't be capable of doing, period. If anything, Halsey's actions run the extreme risk of her getting turned into the authorities by Silver Team. But barring all of that, there's still the glaring issue that she's asking 3 Spartans to stop an entire UNSC base from apprehending Master Chief.
What?
As militarily competent as Spartans are in this universe, there's a vast difference between having them wipe out an entire detachment of elites versus taking on a literal base full of Marines. Plus, I'm not totally convinced that Halsey is even capable of risk assessment, since having them do this could result in the UNSC losing 3 high-level military assets instead of 1. Though back on the Pelican, Chief is trying to find a way to override the ship's controls to manual, only for Kwan to channel her inner Mary Sue.
You are now in manual mode.
I bypassed the compressor.
Lucky that she didn't end up starting a fire in the only means of escape they have. Lucky that none of those bullets didn't end up ricocheting and hitting one of them. Lucky that she managed to shoot the exact circuit to bypass the automatic controls, rather than sending the ship into absolute haywire. And the sad thing is, I was actually about to praise this show for having her not do insane nonsense like this. I suppose it's simply too much to ask to have normal characters do things that normal characters would reasonably do. But shortly afterwards, John and Kwan are EMP'd out of the sky, where Silver Team then shows up to stand around and pretend to stop people from apprehending MC. In fact, their act of defiance is so inconsequential that no one within the UNSC even bothers to bring it up. So once again, we're given an incredibly flimsy setup with virtually no payoff. There's a recurring theme with the writing for this show. Events and character motivations are immediately established in the script, only to create an end result so pointless that they might as well have not even existed in the first place. However, if you thought we were done with all the crazy alien MacGuffin magic, well then...
Surprise, motherfucker!
What a load of bullshit.
Usually I can suspend my disbelief for the sake of mysticism. There's plenty of content that asks this of the viewer, and being incapable of doing so would bar oneself off from a plethora of really great storytelling. But when incorporating mysticism into your story, there has to be a standard associated with it. A proper understanding of how it functions, or at the very least a proper understanding of the extent in which it functions. Though once again, these keystones hold no consistent through line. They're memory restoration devices, gateways to Halo installations, and in this specific case, EMPs. An EMP that's capable of turning the entire UNSC headquarters completely dark, but can somehow power John's Pelican simultaneously. There's no explanation or clearly defined set of parameters attached to these artifacts. They exist solely in service of the plot, for the writers to use on a moment's whim. Because rather than having to put in the work to portray John doing something resourceful to get them both out of an incredibly daunting situation, it's far easier to resort to a MacGuffin to solve the issue entirely. With a fully functioning ship, though, John and Kwan jet off for the asteroid outpost of Rubble, composed of UNSC defectors, insurrectionists, criminals, and is helmed by the dude that MC screwed over years ago in boot camp.
You've got 5 minutes, and then I'm waking up the entire camp.
Not exactly the first place I'd pick to maintain a low profile. Based on past experiences, it should realistically be the worst place to go, with insanely huge ramifications if they ever do end up running into Sorren. But on their way to the station, the two of them have a good old-fashioned heart-to-heart moment.
Why are you doing this?
Would you let a kid be executed?
No.
Why not?
Because it's wrong.
Really? The people behind the show can't think of anything more profound for our main characters to expound upon than child murder bad? This is the best $200 million could churn out? And I'm not exactly sure what's more depressing. The fact that a considerable amount of runtime for this episode is being wasted on subject matter so painfully fucking basic, or that John was Ramboing down kids until he touched a magic alien rock that gave him free will. I'm sure glad we got a more humanized and vulnerable version of this character. Meanwhile, on Reach, Dr. Halsey and Lord Hood have a conversation about what should be done with Master Chief.
What does one do with a superhuman you're not sure you can trust? So if you have a plan, the committee should hear it. Just keep it light.
You're concerned that your top military asset has gone completely AWOL and is currently in possession of a potentially dangerous alien artifact, but you don't want an in-depth plan presented to the council about how Halsey is going to keep John under tight wraps? Or to hear a plan about how to get him back in the first place?
Do you know how I rose to this position? By keeping my mind clear of unnecessary concerns.
What do you define to be an unnecessary concern exactly? Because John is arguably your most valuable weapon you have against the Covenant. And it's painfully obvious that neither Halsey or Parengoski have control over the situation. Why is this version of Lord Hood such an unbearable melon who's indifferent to everything? We then cut back to Chief and Kwan arriving at the outpost, only for the two of them to end up getting swarmed by mercs. I suppose all their reactions to seeing a Spartan is pretty standard with what we know about this version of the UNSC. Granted, Chief is cloaked in literal plot armor, which is not a flaw exclusive to the show, but it should still be something for these mercs to consider during a confrontation like this. Though who knows, maybe all of them are just conveniently unaware of how god tier his armor actually is. Either way, there's still some pretty massive issues with the setup for this scene. First off, Chief is clearly flying a UNSC ship, and given this station's disposition to anything remotely affiliated with the UNSC, surely their tower control would refuse to allow them to dock, or at the very least be incredibly apprehensive about it. Secondly, it makes no sense why the rest of the base wouldn't have been alerted that a UNSC Pelican has just docked at their spaceport. For a settlement entirely made up of outlaws, that should be some pretty disconcerting news. What if a detachment of Marines, or worse, a small squad of Spartans, had been sent to wipe everyone out? This is a massive hole in Rebel security, and no one here really seems to give it any mind. In fact, their solution for keeping a biogenetically enhanced super soldier blocked off from freely walking around the station is to just stack some boxes in front of him with a forklift. Because he can't just force the driver out of the seat and move the forklift himself, he can't clearly move through this man-sized gap on the left to get around, he simply can't just knock these boxes over because he's a Spartan. I guess we need John to move this entire forklift to show the audience what everyone at this point already knows. And I'm a little unclear what their plan was even if they did manage to keep him locked in with the forklift. He has a gun, none of them are protected behind any form of cover, and as Sorren aptly points out,
John here wanted you dead, you'd be dead.
Though it is incredibly convenient that he treats Chief like a lifelong friend and not someone who effectively tried to screw him over the last time they spoke. Maybe their past history wouldn't be enough incentive for Sorren to go toe-to-toe with Chief, but I can't necessarily imagine it'd be enough for him to go out of his way to help John either. Granted, I'm certainly not going to complain about having him in the show. Sorren is one of the only characters who refuses to put up with Kwan's bullshit.
You can't do this.
You owe me one ship and a shitload of deuterium money. You're gonna work off that debt.
Either way, he then informs the both of them that Lord Space Nazi has put a bounty out on Kwan. In a surprise turn of events, she's now apparently being hunted on two fronts, despite the fact that everyone who was once part of the resistance on Madrigal has essentially either been executed or slaughtered by the Covenant, and her attempts at a UNSC disinformation campaign would be utterly embarrassing. The script still insists that Kwan is an extremely important character.
Because you are a character, doesn't mean that you have character.
However, upon learning this, the two of them immediately decide to walk through a hive of criminals and mercenaries with someone who they're unsure they can totally trust, and Chief still refuses to wear his goddamn helmet. I know we have to constantly be shown Pablo Schreiber's lifeless 1,000-yard stare every 5 minutes, but God forbid we ever actually have John do something competent on occasion. Miraculously, none of them end up getting shot at or killed despite taking a ride on the Rubble's death trap excuse for a public transportation system. I mean seriously, what would happen if the arm of your cart just didn't catch onto the rail? Would you just keep floating out into the infinite void of space? Why not rely on something far more effective like hover technology, which would obviously be available to them because how the hell else are they able to get resources to an inhabited asteroid field? Why is it that in a story set 500 to 600 years into the future, humanity is still having to rely on metro systems with no seating or safety mechanisms? And maybe I wouldn't linger on this topic for so long if this script didn't have such a bizarre compulsion to brush aside any potentially compelling concepts or interesting conversations about space travel.
If you think of space like a ball of yarn with multiple threads to the same destination.
You're ruining it.
The backdrop of a sci-fi setting is present, but the moment this script has to rationalize specific mechanics or world build on any level, the faint glimmer of immersion this show has to offer inevitably crumbles away like sand, because none of the ideas presented on screen are fully realized, despite the years of groundwork that's already been laid out and is readily accessible to the writing team. Which, speaking of unrealized concepts, we then cut away to a scene on the High Charity, where an elite is describing to the prophets and Frosk what he saw after Master Chief touched the artifact. They then conclude that the artifact is a keystone, whatever the fuck that means. And upon discovering this, Frosk immediately demands to all of them that she's going to retrieve it on her own. The three of them then explain to her why that's a really bad idea since she's the only living known person aside from John who can interact with them, but still end up allowing her to go through with it anyways. Which I have to admit, I'm still a little confused with how their power dynamic works exactly. So these versions of the prophets took her in and raised/mentored her, effectively saving Frosk from having to live a life on the streets. But yet she holds a higher position than all of them and is basically commanding the Covenant? Right, because that isn't confusing at all. Anyways, we then cut to a scene on Madrigal, where in typical mustache-twirling fashion, Lord Space Nazi is killing off the remnants of his political opposition, only to discover that a drone has been recording him the entire time. Now I'm really not asking for much here. Hell, you can still have Venture be the stereotypically evil piece of shit villain for all I care. But Lord Space Nazi gained his position through some form of competency. I'm assuming. And surely he'd be aware that having all of this caught on camera would absolutely make him look like an evil shitbag. There should be an obvious imperative for him to try to spin the situation, or assure everyone watching that his administration is operating within the UNSC's interests. But apparently being evil in this series also makes you a paint-huffing brainlet, and Lord Space Nazi decides on the spot to commit what should amount to political suicide. Kwan then starts expositing the same tired-out recycled talking point about how Madrigal has been taken over by a bad man, because UNSC bad. Never mind that her focus should be primarily placed on the alien existential threat that wiped out everyone she's ever cared about right before her very eyes in a matter of sheer seconds. Never mind what happened to her colony is bound to happen to other planets and settlements. The mass culling of the human race is inconsequential compared to her political aspirations for Madrigal.
What a bitch.
There's a prominent disconnect here between the painstakingly obvious reality of events taking place in-universe and the choices this borderline irrelevant side character is making in the script. A vast majority of her decisions and perspectives aren't informed from any of her own personal experiences. She solely operates upon what she immediately wants, without any concern for what others have already done for her, or what it might take in order to achieve it. Which ultimately results in Kwan being an extremely unrelatable character. Keep in mind too that it's only been a day since the death of her father, and she never spends a single moment in this entire series to mourn him. Either the two of them weren't remotely close to one another, despite her unusual obsession to follow in his footsteps, or Kwan's just a full-blown sociopath. However, apparently Sorren's wife is able to empathize with her situation quite a bit.
I lost my whole family when I was just a little younger than you are now. Lost my whole planet to the Covenant.
And when was that exactly? 1922? Because nothing quite screams Halo like a flapper chick from The Great Gatsby offering drugs to a teenager.
What is it? Clarity. I think I've had enough clarity for one day, thanks.
Which is a little surprising, considering she was more than willing to take a trip last episode. But all jokes aside, Daisy claimed that the Covenant wiped out her settlement when she was around the same age as Kwan. Now call me crazy all you like, but if what she's saying is true, then that already heavily fucks with continuity. If I'm assuming correctly, Daisy's colony would have been raided 20 plus years ago. Which means there'd have been 20 plus years of humanity dealing with the Covenant, and yet their existence is somehow still a surprise to Kwan and the insurrectionists of Madrigal. Over 20 years of the UNSC having their researchers studying this threat, and yet...
We've been fighting these alien creatures for years and we still have no idea what they want, where to find them, or how to beat them.
The significance of cause and effect in this story is distilled down to a grade slightly above meaningless. There is no solid foundation to build from because the structure of the plot is constantly being undermined by the writer's desire to force hammer events into the timeline. Events that couldn't have happened based on everything else that's been established in the past episode. However, we unfortunately have to cut back to the UNSC Council holding a meeting on Reach. They discuss a wide assortment of topics, though the main item of contention is the prospect of being able to control Master Chief and Spartans as a whole.
But what good is he to the war effort if he can't be controlled?
It's called Cortana. It will overwrite Spartan consciousness and replace it with our artificial general intelligence. We will create Spartans who are more lethal, and most importantly, controllable.
What about John? You can't just replace his mind. We are talking about a person.
Did Captain Keys suddenly morph into a different version of Captain Keys mid-conversation? He seemed totally on board with violating Chief's humanity and controlling him like a lapdog a few seconds ago.
But what good is he to the war effort if he can't be controlled?
So what fucking gives? Is he concerned about what's ethical, or does the conflict with the Covenant take greater priority? In a show with better dialogue, plot structure, and character development, an inner conflict like this could be a compelling arc for Jacob to undergo, but the concept is botched completely during this scene. Jacob doesn't come across as someone whose moral compass is shaken. In fact, he lays out his perspective rather dogmatically at the beginning of this meeting, only to immediately challenge Halsey's proposal on the grounds of ethics. This entire exchange is a product of the writers trying to artificially inject tension between characters where there realistically shouldn't be. And unfortunately, none of this is supported by just how truly god-awful Halsey's proposal is. Her plan for controlling a rogue, biogenetically enhanced super soldier and the rest of the Spartans is to override their consciousness with an artificial intelligence, thereby relinquishing an army of mindless murder machines over to a sentient program. What would happen if Cortana wasn't capable of controlling Chief or the rest of the Spartans? What would happen if Halsey and her creepy stalker assistant were incapable of controlling Cortana? What would happen if the sentient program Halsey created solely for the purpose of protecting humanity decided to use the Spartans to wipe out mankind? There are massive implications attached to using artificial intelligence, especially in this capacity, and yet no one seems to be concerned over any of them. Even Admiral Parangosky, who specifically prohibited her from moving forward with the Cortana project, immediately caves to such a cataclysmically horrible idea. Halsey's actions at best clearly break the chain of command, and at worst are straight up illegal.
And didn't that process depend on biological substrates, derived from the illegal practice of flash cloning humans?
Later on in the episode, however, John then shows Sorren what's inside the box.
I know a guy. Guy's name is Wrath. He got taken into a Covenant ship and lived to talk about it.
Of course you have a guy, because nothing is ever earned in this half-assed retelling of the Halo storyline. Everything has to unfold in the most contrived bullshit fashion possible. I mean, honestly, what are the freaking odds that this one station he chose to hide from the UNSC at is helmed by the guy, who realistically should hate John's guts and at the very least have him locked up, is able to lead MC directly to the one person who can give him information on his MacGuffin? Why even entertain trying to add any ounce of mystery to the plot when it's effectively going to be handed to Chief on a silver platter anyways? Unfortunately, despite Sorren having no clear incentive to help John whatsoever, he ends up bringing MC and Kwan to what he insists is a refuge and not a psych ward. I'm not sure if I totally buy that, since everyone in here is clearly, in some form, a danger to themselves and the rest of Rubble society. Because why else would the entrance to this supposed refuge be locked behind a security gate with a dedicated code? Then again, maybe it isn't a jail, considering none of their cells are locked and that these crazies can just climb out of them at any moment even if they were. Moving on though, Sorren then introduces John to Sci-Fi Smeagol. I really wish I was playing a sick, twisted practical joke on you. I wish that this parody of the Halo franchise, which spent years in production hell and cost hundreds of millions of dollars to produce, didn't vomit out this creatively bankrupt, cringe-inducing exposition machine. If you needed a clear example of Showtime's and 343's tone deafness, then search no further.
The image you made him produce, the ring, that's what they want! So it's a weapon.
Yeah. I never imagined I'd see Master Chief, the icon of stoic badassery, slam a low-budget version of Gollum up against a wall and scream, "What am I?" in a shitty Christian Bale Batman impersonation. I never imagined that the writers would have this actual pit stain of a character make the grand reveal to John about what function the Halo installations serve, let alone reveal it in the second episode. Part of what made the reveal so compelling in the first game was the immense stakes attached to activating or destroying the ring. This map that you're interacting with and exploring as the player, steadily unraveling the mystery of what role the Halo installations serve throughout the course of the game, ultimately becomes a death trap that you have to escape. What you initially believe to be some form of refuge from the Covenant is actually a weapon capable of eliminating all sentient life, setting the proper scale for the impact of your actions made in universe. But that sense of mystery and exploration is diminished here. It's substituted with a hollow throwaway line to circumvent John from having to actually spend time on this installation, to avoid putting in the proper effort to shape Chief's character through meaningful experiences in the plot. The ring is merely turned into another target for the UNSC to eliminate. Though after that absolute train wreck of a scene, John decides on the spot to return back to Reach to inform the UNSC of what he's discovered. Sorren then proceeds to challenge Chief, saying that he's actually just running back to Halsey, and that she apparently doesn't give a shit about him. Which is more than likely true, but now seems like the worst time to bring all of this up, considering the three of them just learned that the Halo installations are
the end of life as we know it.
John and Sorren then proceed to have a heated exchange about their beef from boot camp, only for the conversation to take a sudden weird turn.
Can I trust you?
Of course you can
Then
trust
keep her
me.
safe.
I give you my word.
Sorren, why in the absolute fuck are you promising him anything? John screwed you over in the past, has made zero effort to rectify that mistake, and is trying to force you to look after this random teenager. Not to mention that you allowed him to hide out here from the UNSC. If anything, he owes you a favor and then some. In all honesty, I should be much harsher on Sorren for making such a boneheaded decision, but he's the only halfway decent character in this entire series. Now, before we directly jump into episode 3, for my and everyone else's sanity, I will only be touching on the more crucial plot elements. Mainly because fuck all really happens in this episode. I'll do my best to avoid as much filler material as I can, but frankly, there's a lot of it. We effectively start things off with Admiral Parangoski briefing Miranda about the artifact, despite Halsey specifically instructing her not to inform Miranda on it.
I want you to lead a team in analyzing this artifact.
Separate teams.
Parallel teams.
What
But
weapon?
Dr.
Why am I only hearing about this now?
Know exactly why.
I don't understand.
And if it was up to her, you still wouldn't know anything about it?
Don't you outrank Halsey, though? What would you stand to gain by keeping one of your top researchers in the dark on an incredibly critical project like this? You've been fighting the Covenant for decades with no means of potentially being able to counter them until now, and you've waited until this very moment to have more than one of your researchers study this artifact? What even are the stakes exactly? Whole planets are being glassed. Rebel outposts who've somehow been able to secure their independence from the UNSC are getting absolutely decimated. But yet none of that is important enough to mobilize your staff to immediately work on the most significant scientific breakthrough humanity has ever uncovered? To say the events of this universe are disjointed from one another would be putting it very mildly.
I'm interested in finding a way to be less reliant on Dr. Halsey moving forward.
If you truly believed that, then why in the absolute hell did you greenlight the Cortana trial in the first place? Confronting her about the fact that she went over your head with this project in front of Lord Hood, all while addressing how insanely dangerous and illegal her plan is, would have heavily set her back, confining Halsey to search for more viable alternatives. But I guess we needed this supposed meaningful exchange between Miranda and Parangoski to happen, even though parallel teams should already be the standard procedure for this type of thing anyway. Also, you're probably wondering why I haven't really talked that much about Miranda until now. Well, it's quite simple. Much like everything else about the show, this version of Miranda Keys is absolutely worthless. Her place in the entire story is to whine about the fact that Dr. Halsey is her mom, and that she doesn't allow her to do cool science shit with her. Which to a certain extent, I can understand why Halsey constantly refuses. It only takes her 4 whole episodes to discover the concept of translating foreign languages.
You Spartans have spent more time with the Covenant than anyone. What other St. Haley wars do you know? I can't believe we didn't do this years ago.
Yeah, neither can I, Miranda. Getting back on track though, we're then given our first look at a live-action depiction of Cortana.
Hello, Dr. Halsey.
I wish I could say I'm relieved that they asked for Jen Taylor to reprise her role, but if anything, I'm pretty pissed that I'm forced to have to stare at this Windows Movie Maker version of Cortana. Regardless, she then asks Halsey why she's unable to take full control of Master Chief.
But I'm unable to take full operational control of the subject.
Yes, for the moment I have limited your access to the reticular formation.
Yes, apparently it's possible to limit the functionality of an AI despite the fact that
She represents the sum total of every available data point.
Cortana can process the entire trove of human knowledge in a matter of sheer seconds, and is theoretically capable of altering her code on a whim. For being the most advanced sentient program to ever exist, she should constantly be improving at a rate far beyond human comprehension. Still, we can't ignore one of, if not the primary reason for integrating Cortana with Chief's consciousness, is to have complete control of John, to prevent him from acting too far out of line, to keep his emotions in check and his memory suppressed. Surely Halsey wouldn't actively instruct Cortana to go against arguably the main directive she was created to serve, right?
Chief is trying to remove his emotional regulator.
I'll take care of the pellets. It's better that he sees you as an accomplice rather than a spy.
He'll still ultimately view Cortana as a spy whenever you inevitably have to use her to control him anyways. How can there be any form of trust between the two of them when Cortana is effectively designed to be John's on-off switch? Plus, the MacGuffin overrode Chief's emotional regulator whenever he touched the rock back on Madrigal. It's kind of why he went rogue during the first episode. So him taking out his pellet should mechanically have no impact on his ability to fully interact with the artifact. It's actually quite a shame that all of Master Cheek's characterization in this show is just ham-fisted through flashback sequences and utter contrivance. There was plenty of potential to properly flesh out his back history, and to present Chief with really difficult moral choices, but instead he's simply reduced down to a walking plot device. Meanwhile on the Rubble, Kwan then demands to have Sorren take her back to Madrigal.
Finch is taking over. I have to join the resistance.
What resistance? Do you not remember watching all of them get executed on live broadcast? You have absolutely nothing left to return to. Plus there's just this teeny tiny little detail of the massive bounty placed on your head. It's actually a full-blown miracle that she's able to casually stroll through this market and not have people chomping at the bit to gun her down. But after having Sorren refuse to hear her out, she then attempts to steal one of his ships, only to end up getting caught in the act.
I have money.
You got nothing.
My family is rich.
How rich?
Deuterium rich.
I'm gonna get paid either way. If not from you, then from the bounty on your head.
So first off, it's an incredibly tough sell to convince me that her family was somehow rich, all while living in this complete backwater dump of an outpost. You'd think they'd have invested all that money into actually fortifying and properly manning this base, but weirder things have happened in the show, I suppose. Secondly, it's more than obvious that Kwan was initially holding out on Sorren in the hope that he would help her get back to Madrigal as a simple act of kindness, only to resort to stealing from him rather than offering to fairly compensate Sorren with her abundant amount of inheritance money for an extremely dangerous task. This is an incredibly damning revelation of Kwan's character. The writers clearly crafted her with the intent of being a relatable protag, but in all reality, Kwan is a full-blown opportunistic parasite, willing to screw over anyone in pursuit of her political aspirations. It's an unreasonable ask of the viewer to connect with a character whose void of admirable qualities is entirely dependent on other people and berates those who go out of their way to help her. She may be less of an evil shitbag compared to Venture, though that bar isn't set particularly all that high. Call it whatever you like, but this is an egregious case of fundamentally bad character design. However, that'll unfortunately have to wrap up the first part of this Halo Season 1 critique. I initially planned for this project to be one whole comprehensive piece, but as you can clearly tell, I have a fair amount to say about this show, and I'm not quite prepared to dive into the deep end of content creation just yet. Rest assured though, the other installments are coming very soon. In the meantime, if for some reason you feel inclined to support what I do, you can check out all the various links down below in the description, or just simply hit subscribe to see more videos like this in the future.